And while you're doing that, I'll do my hosting job here, formally introducing you. Everyone, This is Dr. Brandon Schamp. He is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Algoma University. He'll tell you a bit more about that. And just a quick reminder, while you're watching the slideshow and listening to Dr. Schamp's presentation, you can go ahead and type out questions in the Q&A section, and we'll just queue them up. So you don't need to wait until the Q&A portion of our webinar today. If you have a question while we're going through the slides, just quickly type it in, and then we'll ask it when we have a chance. And I see those slides are up, so I will let you take it away.
All right, thanks very much. All right, the first question that people typically ask me when I talk about what I do and where I'm from is just where is Algoma University? So I put a picture up of Algoma University. It's in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, which is probably north for many of you if you're from Ontario. And I put this picture up because it's a very snowy place. We get sometimes between 4 and 5 meters of snow every year. So it's a really beautiful place in the winter as long as you like snow. Okay, so that's actually where Sault Ste. Marie is. So you can kind of get a sense of where Southern Ontario is, closer to Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And I'm way up here in Sault Ste. Marie, near the A there, which is kind of at the corner of Lake Superior. So we get lots of snow and rain coming off of there, but it's also pretty warm. There's lots of forest around, lots of beautiful natural fields, and we get lots of local animals. And there's definitely lots of plants. And that interests me because I basically study plants. So I do a lot of my research in places like this. This is the field where my students do research, and one of my students is sitting out there in the field in that picture with a little bit of low-lying hills in the background. But what I want to point out here is just that there's maybe about 40 different plant species in that little field. And one of the main questions we like to ask is just how can there be so many species in that field? Why isn't it that one doesn't just take over? Why don't you just get one super plant that destroys and outcompetes all the others? So I've always been interested in that, and my students look at that. And we're also interested in why some species are just more common than others. Some species are really abundant and others aren't, and yet those really common ones don't seem to take over at any time. So in particular, I like to study how competition between these different plants bears out. Right. So where do I do that? This is the lab that I work in and my students work in. So we do a lot of things like measuring plants, and we counting plants and planting different transplants and doing experiments, some of which might end up back in the field. We could plant plants back out in the field. We often look very closely at plant communities to see how things are growing together, which plants grow together well and which plants don't grow together well. But what I always notice about a picture like this is just how competitive a place like this is. So when plants interact with their environment, they're also interacting with each other, and they're not doing so nicely. Plants don't play nicely together. What I always tell people who don't know much about these communities is that it's very different than it is for humans. A plant may have as many as 1 million children or seeds, or produce 1 million seeds in its lifetime, and on average only one of those will survive to be an adult. So it's a very different kind of environment. There's lots of death, essentially, lots of competition. It's a very competitive environment, and there's a lot of it's a very hard struggle for life in these places. So we find that very interesting. These are some of the places we work are really beautiful. I'm actually in that field, although you can kind of only see my butt sticking out of the middle there. But we get to work in some really beautiful places, and if you look closely, you can see that there's lots of different plants that are growing together. And so again, one is not taking over everything, which is good. We like to look around and see a bunch of different things. It's very nice. So that, we call that biodiversity. Very diverse collection of different species out there, and we go out and we take it for granted, but we don't realize how competitive it is, that they're really fighting for their very survival.
So I'm just trying to interject here briefly, because we have a question that's very timely, and I thought you may wish to answer it along your way through. We have a question from Ms. Najman's class. I hope I'm saying that right. What are the blue flags used for?
Ah, yes. So the blue flags mark out areas where we measure different things. Sometimes they mark out individual plants that we're following their growth of, and sometimes they mark out a certain area where we measure the number of plants or the number of plant species in, because different patches of ground can have maybe 2 species in a meter squared area that those flags would mark out, or some of them have as many. I think there's been places around the world where in a single meter square you might find nearly 100 species of plant. So we mark off those areas to compare different areas.
And I don't want to get with too many questions here in the middle of the presentation, but we have another question from Ms. Knight's
Sure.
Class in Caledon, Ontario, asking what a species is.
Okay. Well, that can be a tricky question, but usually the biological definition of species is a group of organisms that reproduce together or have the capacity to reproduce together. So these are things that look similar, and they're essentially, in the case of plants, not every plant can produce seeds with any other, using the pollen of any other species or any other plant. So groups of plants. In this picture, you would see, for example, the yellow flowered species. That's a common plant in Ontario, at least, called goldenrod. And there's about 4 or 5 different species of goldenrod, even in that field that you're looking at. But only within the species can they actually reproduce or produce seeds, although sometimes there is hybridization. The definition can be a bit murky sometimes, but overall it's a bunch of organisms that essentially have the capacity to reproduce together.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to step back from asking you questions so that you can keep showing us these pictures and telling us a bit about what you do.
Sure. This is another way that I like to do experiments. So this is a competition experiment I once did in a greenhouse. So where we grow plants together and we see how growing with each other, how well they do. Some do really well growing with others, some do very poorly, depending on whether they compete. Sometimes plants can interact positively where one plant actually helps another, and that can even be across species. So we do greenhouse experiments like this as well. Now we do encounter animals up here, as I mentioned. This is a baby black bear who's very interested in my front porch. In particular, he's interested in my empty bird feeder. What he's standing on is a small, about 1 meter high railing, trying to get into my bird feeder. We do run into these bears, and I have to train my students to avoid or deal with bears if they encounter them. So they take out bear spray and they have to be watchful. Most bears aren't a problem. They're just looking for food, and if you stay out of their way, they'll stay out of yours. But we do encounter those kinds of things. But this is an example of animals, different animal species interacting. And I always point out that humans, and my kids often will say to me, well, humans aren't animals, but of course we are animals. And so the case of us interacting with bears, as I interacted this morning over my coffee with a bear outside my window, is an example of how humans or different animals interact in our environment. Humans are a very important animal in that sense, as we interact. And if there is a species in the world that does take over, humans would be closest to being that species. There are lots of other ways, though, that plants and animals interact. This is a nice picture of something that you may see commonly. This is a butterfly interacting with a plant, and it's getting some sort of nectar or pollen from this flower, and it helps that particular plant species produce seeds. So without this butterfly or without other pollinators, they wouldn't be able to produce seeds. So there's an arrangement here. So different organisms can interact by trading things, right? Just like kids can trade Pokemon cards. In this case, the plant is trading some food for a particular service that helps the plant produce seeds, right? So there's trading relationships between different organisms as well, and it doesn't have to be just in humans. This doesn't look like a trading arrangement between this bear and these berries. The bear is clearly eating the berries. You would think it's easy to see what the bear gets out of this, but the plant also gets something out of this. The plant's fruits actually have to go through a bear before, or some animal, before they will turn into a new plant or grow into a new plant. So the bear provides two services. Its stomach acids get rid of all the parts of the seed that aren't going to help it grow, and the bear delivers it to a nice other area. And not only does it deliver it to a new area to grow, it tends to plant the seed in a fairly fertile clump of something that it leaves behind. All right, so there is a trading relationship there. So animals and plants, in this case, are interacting. Even when you're eating fruits, you're helping out a plant. Now, plants in general don't want to be eaten. Fruits are kind of the exception. As long as you don't crunch up the seeds, then the plants do just fine and are happy to have you distribute their seeds by eating their berries. Right? Plants have other kinds of interactions with animals. Right? Most of us live in some sort of house or apartment. We probably figured that out by looking around. We can see something like this. This is a barred owl that lives in the area where I grow, or where I live. I guess I'm growing too. But it's making its home in this tree. And we've, of course, learned to use trees and wood from trees to build our own structures and homes. So we often are inspired by animals to live these ways. And this is an interaction as well. And this is another example where beavers use wood and cut down parts of trees to build their own shelters. Some of you have seen this kind of thing. So plants form shelter for many animals, lots of different animals, and there are porcupines, squirrels, other things, birds, of course, all use plants for shelter. Plants, as I mentioned earlier, can also work together. There's two different kinds of plants here. There's corn and beans. There's rows of corn and beans. And what's interesting about that is that both plants grow better when they're growing together than they do when they're growing on their own. And that's because bean plants help provide nitrogen fertilizer because of a special relationship they have with bacteria in their roots. They provide nitrogen for the corn to grow. And as the corn grows, beans are actually a climbing plant. And so the beans benefit by being able to climb up the corn to get more sunlight. So both plants grow together very well. And this is a way that two plants can interact, and it's not a negative interaction. So it's not a competitive or interaction where one is suffering from it. So both do well, and this is something that I study, and it's called facilitation. So one plant facilitates the growth of the other, or both plants facilitate the growth of the other. That's very important in crop growth. So this is one reason why traditionally Native peoples in North America planted beans and corn together, and why this kind of crop growth still continues today. It's a good idea. This is another picture of some facilitation. In very, very dry habitats, you'll often find plants that grow close together in clusters, and that's because they provide shade to one another. And where one plant grows, the water doesn't evaporate as quickly, so there's more water available for all the plants. And so that's another form of plants working together. Right? Plants are often thought of as the victim in relationships between animals and plants, and definitely some animals just eat plants. They just eat them and the plants die, and that's that. But in this case, this is an example of a plant that grows here in Ontario and in many parts of boreal Canada all across the north. This is a pitcher plant. The leaves form cups that fill with water, and it releases a digestive chemical into it. And it basically smells funny, and bugs come around and end up getting stuck in the water, and the plant digests the bugs and eats them. When I told my kids about this, they asked me, well, are there ones that are big enough to eat humans? No, thankfully not. But there are some small ones, and there's actually two different types of plants in this picture that are insectivorous, as you might call them, or they eat insects. And they often do this because they grow in bogs where there's not that much nutrients. So there's lots of water, but not a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. And so they eat these bugs to get that nitrogen and phosphorus they need. So that gives you the scope of a lot of the different ways that plants and animals interact, and some of the ways that I'm interested in how those interactions produce the patterns of species that we see out in nature. So are those patterns of competition and facilitation determining, do they tell us why some species are more abundant than others and why some species live together and some species don't? That's what I'm interested in finding out. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions if you have any.
Well, I'm glad that you are ready to answer questions, because we have quite a few that have built up here along the way. So we'll see how many questions we can get to. First, we have questions from Caledon, Ontario at Credit View Public School. Henry, Anna Marie, Aiden, and Kevin were asking, how long will a tomato plant live? And Emma and Pearl were asking about the average lifespan of a fern. And I'm going to add one more into the mix for you. Three-pronged question. Chris and Kevin wondered, what is the longest time a plant can live for? So maybe we can kind of just talk about lifespan in general.
Sure. Okay, that's an interesting one, especially because for some plants, especially plants that die back each year, it's really hard to know how long they live. So they last as roots under the ground, and we don't know how long some plants live, but we definitely do know for some of those plants. Tomato plants, where they're from originally in South and Central America, they lived for longer, but humans have selected different varieties that grow faster so that we can grow them in the north. Basically, they could not survive the winter here. So what they had to do was look for fast-growing tomato plants that would grow and finish producing fruit and then die in a single year. So that's why if you have parents for gardeners and they like tomatoes, they grow them for a single year and then they have to replant them the next year, or buy new seedlings or plant them from seed. I planted about 25 from seed this year myself. But traditionally, they were much longer growing, and they come from areas that are much warmer. So they could have grown for longer. I don't know what the traditional lifespan of the tomato was before we started shortening it for convenient gardening. There's some other reasons to make it grow for a shorter amount of time, but they're more complicated. But the main reason is so you can move it north and move it around a little bit better. So the reason we can grow tomatoes here is because human scientists and farmers have picked the tomatoes that grow the fastest and can get done in a growing season here in colder parts of the world, temperate parts of the world. Now, in terms of a fern, that's one that I don't know the answer to, but a lot of herbaceous plants, and that means non-woody plants like trees and things like that, but the stuff that dies back each winter, that would be a herbaceous plant. They range in lifespan. Some of them only grow for 1 year, and some of them grow for 50 to 100 years. There are lots of plants that are very small that you might think, oh, that's a short-lived plant. It's probably going to live longer than us. So do I know for ferns in particular? I know that they vary. I don't know how much they vary, so I don't know the answer to that one. In terms of the longest lived plant, it's very difficult to tell, and one of the reasons for that is, imagine this pen is a tree, right? Especially one kind of tree, it can grow and produce seeds, but it can also grow under the ground and pop up as another tree beside it that's attached to it. And then the original one can die, but this is still the same plant, and this one can live longer. So it's hard to know how long some plants have lived. Some people, some scientists, believe that there are plants, in particular aspens, or sometimes we call them poplar trees, that there are groves of them in the Americas that many thousands of kilometers, and they're all the same plant, and that the same plant has been alive and spreading underground for thousands of years.
So there seems to be a lot that we don't necessarily know for sure on that lifespan front, but it
tends to be one of those things that until we get scientists that live for 500 to 1,000 years, we're not going to get them studying those things as easily.
Maybe a little while then before we figure those things out. Yeah. So next I want to go to a question from Ms. Jensen's grade 2s in Toronto. They would like to know what happens if there is not enough of one plant or too much of another plant.
Right. So the best thing to think of in terms of there being too much of one plant is that it would get rid of some others that we might like, right? So some of you will have heard of invasive species, and invasive species are ones that become very abundant and start to edge out or get rid of some of the other species. They're usually species that have come in from somewhere else, maybe from Europe or from Asia, and the plants that are already here are maybe not used to competing with them, or there's some advantage that that incoming plant has. And invasive species don't have to be plants. I think about plants mostly because of my own work, but they can be animals. There's invasive fish that are invading grass carp that are invading the Great Lakes as well. And they get rid of, the danger is that they'll get rid of some other fish and we'll lose some of the other things that we like. That's the real danger.
Okay.
If things get very rare, then the danger is that even something very small can get rid of them altogether. Like, you know, if you end up with only a couple of pandas left, and then a disease hits pandas, you could lose them all.
So that brings us to a question from Ms. Jansen's class asking if plants can be called endangered.
Yeah, there are endangered plant species. So, you know, when I think of endangered plant species, they're often plant species that, for whatever reason, we've either gotten rid of the habitat where they live, maybe we've turned it into a city, or maybe we decided that we really like to eat that plant and it's slowly disappearing. So there's some plants in southern Ontario, for example. One that comes to mind is there's a Canadian ginseng that we don't see very much of. In fact, I've never seen it, and I've been to a lot of forests. So I don't see it very often, and I suspect that the reason is that every time someone sees it, they pick it. Right.
I had to teach my children this spring about not picking trilliums as we found them on the path in the forest in Ontario. I have a question here from Mr. DeFiore's class. They want to know, how does a butterfly get the nectar or the pollen from a plant?
So a butterfly doesn't really have like a mouth with, like we do, like have teeth. Instead, it has what's called a proboscis, and it's basically like its mouth is a long straw that curls up into a spiral circle. And then when it gets to the flower, it tends to open that up, and it reaches that straw deep into the flower, and it sucks up some of the nectar, and in the process, it takes up some pollen. In fact, there was a very famous scientist who some of you will have heard of, Charles Darwin. While he was alive, he found an orchid, a beautiful flower that had a nectar spur, which is a tail basically where the nectar was stored, that was about this long. It was huge. And he never saw it, but he guessed that somewhere there was a moth or a butterfly that had a proboscis, or that nose or that mouth, that long sucking mouth like a straw, that was just as long, that specialized on that plant. And he died, and they didn't find it until after he died, but he was right, and they found it afterwards.
Maybe he's somewhere and he's basking in the glow of being right.
He was right a lot, frankly.
It's true. Let's see. Is there a reason why plants are typically grown in rows in fields when we plant them on purpose? Does that ever happen naturally?
No, it doesn't really. I mean, okay, that's not entirely true. So there are some plants that, for example, you remember I mentioned that plants, sometimes a tree would grow like this, and it would, instead of producing seeds, it would grow up and produce a plant next to it. So you can get plants growing naturally in rows that way. So although it tends to be, you have to start it out in a row and then it continues in a row. So for example, banana plants reproduce in this way. So if you plant a row of banana plants, they'll die back and a new row will come up beside it, and they'll keep growing in rows that way.
So those nice manicured rows, that's just us and how we're planting.
That tends to be us. People like geometry naturally. rather than nature's sort of scattered patterns.
Right. And now Edward would like to know if different plants can interact to create a new species.
Yes, they absolutely can, for sure. And there's a lot of different ways that new species form, but hybridization is one of those. So some species that are closely related can share pollen and produce a new plant. And if it's a little bit different, but it can't reproduce with any of the, let's say you have one species and another species, and then they produce a seed, but the plant from that species can't really reproduce with either of its parent species, then that can lead to a new species forming. So that's one way. There's some other complicated ways that it happens, where gene duplication and things like that. Or what can happen as well is if a plant gets isolated for a long time, like let's say a plant lands on an island and grows there and you get a new population there. If many hundreds of years go by, it can, and even if you took it back and introduced it into the parent population back on the mainland, it wouldn't really interact with that. So you can get new species that way as well. That's a good question. It's a very complicated question. Stick with science and you'll find out more detailed answers.
Absolutely. We now have a question from Waylon in Mr. Stark's class. He wants to know what the coolest plant or your favorite plant that you've ever found.
So, I have 2 kids, and I would never choose a favorite of them. And I would have to say that I try to do the same thing with plants, where I try not to choose a favorite, but it's hard. It's hard. So I'll give you a related example is that I love, there's a plant that grows on my own property in the forest called, some people call it trout lily and some people call it dogtooth violet. But it's basically, it produces 1 or 2 sort of oval leaves that are speckled. And the reason they call it trout lily is because the leaves are speckled like a fish. And it produces this beautiful flower. It's actually a lily, so even though they call it dogtooth violet, it's really a lily. But I've always had an affection for that. So much so that because it grows on my property, when I had a daughter, I named her Violet. So maybe that's a favorite.
It is hard to choose, I'm sure. Next, we have a couple questions from Ms. Natchman's class. Matthew would like to know, in that picture you showed us of the greenhouse, why are some plants growing better than others? And we have another question of why don't some plants grow together and some plants do? And also, what were the white sticks for?
Oh, right. Okay, good questions. So why do some plants grow better than others? Well, part of that is that what you saw there was different kinds of plants. So grasses might look like they were growing better because they were popping straight up and maybe they were this high. But the other ones were little rosettes or producing leaves that were flat to the ground, and eventually later on in their life they would produce a different shoot that would have flowers on it. So part of what you were seeing was not necessarily that one was growing better than the other. Part of it is that they're different types of plants. But part of it is that, but you're absolutely right, part of it is that some of them grow better. But there's a number of reasons. Some of them are just slower at growing than others. So plants that have different maximum sizes, which is something that I've always been interested in, tend to grow at a different rate than plants that have smaller maximum sizes. So some plants take their time to grow and some plants are in a rush, essentially is what that means. And some plants are good competitors for getting nutrients from the soil and some are not as good.
Right. So I'm still sifting through all these questions here. If I haven't gotten to your question, anyone, we'll get there. I hope.
The white sticks, I don't want to forget. The white sticks just held up a cover so the plants don't dry out when they were seedlings, when they were very small. We would put a tarp over them at night so they wouldn't dry out. We would spray them and then we would put a tarp over them so they didn't dry out.
I must admit, I thought it was going to be more complicated, but they're literally just sticks and they happen to be white.
Yeah. super technical sticks.
Yes, yes, of course. So we now have a few questions coming in asking about how many plant species are there in the world, or how many have you come across? I figure that's a pretty big number, but maybe you can help us understand.
Yeah, so this was asked recently to me, and you know what? The number is changing all the time because some people, new species are being discovered still. And also, sometimes they think there's 2 species and it turns out there's 1 species. Sometimes they think there's 1 species and it turns out to be 2 species. So the number is changing all the time, but the last time I looked, the number of recognized plant species was on the order of just 225,000, maybe. How many are in Ontario? I can tell you that because I've taken a look, and I think it's on the neighborhood 3,000 to 4,000 species. How many do I know? Maybe about 2,000. The rest I have to be very careful in trying to figure out what they are. Books are good for that.
That's still a pretty big number of plants to know.
Yeah.
So next we have a question from Jessica, who wants to know, when scientists genetically change some plants, does this change their nutrient value?
Well, yeah, it depends. So genetically, you've got to, imagine for a second that your DNA or your genetics are represented by a big, long string of DNA like this. You can change a lot of different parts of it. And what impact the change has on its nutrient value will depend on which bit you change. People tend not to change a lot. So scientists who do genetic modification tend to change a very small amount of the genes or the genetics or the DNA. The answer is it depends. But I think if the goal, and much of these days, genetic modification is either to produce bigger fruit or to resist herbivores or disease. So those, if it's resistance to herbivores and disease, probably it's not going to impact the nutrient value of the fruit. But if your interest is in making the fruit bigger, absolutely. Some studies have shown, for example, that sometimes we mess up that process. Now, it's not. This is an example that's not strictly genetic modification by scientists injecting or changing the genes manually, but just by selecting particular things over time, characteristics over time. Apples, for example, are much less nutritious than they were, say, 100 years ago, for example. And that's because we chose the apples that looked best and produced the biggest fruits. And those often didn't have as much vitamins and things in them. And they weren't as good for you. They had more water, essentially. So sometimes genetic modification by farmers and scientists together, and by customers, people who go to the store and choose certain types of fruit. Sometimes we're making decisions that aren't based on our own nutrition. Sometimes the reddest, prettiest apple is less good for you.
That's a good lesson, I think, that can be taken into lots of different areas of life beyond apples. Now I want to get to a question. I've seen a few different versions of flying through this feed here. We have a question from Ms. Goulet's class, and they want to know if there are plants that can eat animals larger than insects.
I don't think so. Yeah. So my area of expertise is mostly in plants in the north. In tropical areas, there's always some crazy plants, for sure. There's a lot of plants that don't necessarily eat animals, but there's a lot of plants that can mess you up if you try to mess with them. So I've seen plants that have, for example, little needles on them. One time I went to Australia, and there was a plant there that had these little needles on them. And if you bumped into it, these needles would bend, and there was it was basically like a true needle that had a reservoir at the back, or almost like a bubble at the back, that had a neurotoxin in it. which basically makes your nerves work funny. And if you got poked by one of these things, it felt like you had a hole in your arm for about a year. So that's an example of a plant that, while it doesn't eat you, it wants you to stay away and keep away from it, and it's got a very effective mechanism for keeping you away. There's lots of other ones that, a lot of plants are poisonous. You know, plants, as I mentioned before, they're happy, many of them are happy enough with you eating their fruit, but they don't want you to eat their leaves or stems. So if you start to think of the plants that we eat, more often than not, they're the fruits, and only a very small portion of them can you eat the leaves and stems of without feeling some adverse effects. Plants produce a lot of chemicals to try to stop animals from eating them. Many of those chemicals, actually, humans have found quite useful for medicines in the end, when used very carefully. But a lot of them are designed to stop animals from eating them. Plants don't want to be eaten. And evolution has gone to great lengths to reduce, to ensure that we have a green world. Because if plants could be eaten by everything, we wouldn't have any plants. We just have, very quickly, plants would disappear and we wouldn't have so green a world. So plants don't eat really big organisms very often, if at all. I may be wrong. There may be some that eat slightly bigger ones than insects. I'm pretty sure that there are some of those pitcher plants that I showed that are big enough that they eat small frogs. But that might be about as big as it gets. I don't think we have too much to worry about in terms of animal. There's certainly no plants that I know of that eat humans.
Right. And as you said, as long as we're not bothering those plants, usually there's no injuries either.
Yeah, but I feel like it's really important to say, don't go out and eat plants. Be really careful. Even berries, a lot of berries our bodies can't handle. So you don't just indiscriminately eat plants and berries and things like that. Lots of them are poison.
Right. It's a good message. I have a few more very detailed questions that I'm sorry to those who've asked them. We are out of time and we can't answer them all. However, we've had a few questions about how long you've been studying and how did you come to know all the things that you know. Maybe you could tell us a bit about sort of your path through school and your career,
Sure.
and any advice you have for students who might be interested in following a similar path. Yeah,
so my advice, well, first of all, I've been a scientist, I've been a professor for 9 years. I jokingly say that, when I was in school, I was in school for a long time. I was there till I was 32 years old, so you can stay in school that long. And I jokingly told people at that time that I was in grade 25. But basically, after a long time, from about university onward, it was less like school and more just like doing puzzles all day and reading books that were really interesting. What I always tell people is, if you're interested in science, it can accomplish so much. It really is important. There's a lot of challenges that the world faces, and science is one of the best, if not the best, tools that we have to face many of them. Human populations are getting big. We need scientists. We need lots of scientists. We need people who are curious. If you like doing puzzles, maybe you'd like being a scientist. If you like sitting down and thinking about things carefully for a long time, if you like going out and walking in the forest, that's one of the things that I liked so much and I didn't even know for a long time, but it made me really interested in what was going on in those forests and fields. And so that really contributed to leading me down this path. And I would never have guessed I'd end up here. So don't, let life take you in unusual directions would be some advice, and just find something to be passionate about. And you might not realize what interests you. So when I went into university, I did not want to study plants. I didn't understand plants. They've got no arms, they've got no legs. They seem really weird to me. I didn't understand. I wanted to study animals I could relate to. But in the end, I discovered that the differences were actually even more interesting. And the more I thought about them and the more I learned about them, the more interesting I was. I think you might be surprised where you end up in life, and be open to that. that's what my advice would be. Be open to trying different things out. Try lots of things out until you find one that you love.
Well, thank you so much for that advice and for answering all of our questions today about plants and ecosystems and that we're safe. There are no people-eating plants that we've found yet. So thanks for that, Dr. Schamp.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thanks so much for your interest, everybody. As I said, I love doing this. I love taking questions. You know, I wish I could answer more, but thanks again for participating.
So next up on PIR live event, we're talking about deep sea ecosystems for World Oceans Day. More information on this and other upcoming webinars is available at pirweb.org. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.